So welcome back, everybody. We continue in chapter 33 with the original text. It is on page Membeis, 42nd page, but actually Membeis between the 82 and the 84, the way it's in the Hebrew counting. So where we left off last week is that this which Del Rebbe introduced in the 21st and the 20th and 21st chapter. Del Rebbe began with this general message, which is conveyed on those chapters, of the notion of Achdus Hashem. When we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, what do we mean? What do we mean? What is the proclamation? What do we protest? What are we demonstrating? That Hashem Echad, that Hashem is ultimately one, not only one to the exclusion of two, but everything is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is everything. Like we elaborated and expanded on this very idea, especially with this wording, or the message, the way it's the Ches and the Dalid are part of the Aleph, based on the Gemara. Echad is the oneness of Hashem, the way the Ches and the Dalid, the seven heavens and earth and the four sides of the world, are not a separate part, are inseparable of the Aleph. It's all part of Achdus Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We mentioned the difference of Keil Ha'olam as opposed to Keil Olam, like it says in Chumash Bereshis about Avraham Avinu, that he when he demonstrated the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, doesn't say that he demonstrated that God is the God Ha'olam over a world, which that would connote that Olam is a separate entity and Hashem is Keil, the God, the one who's control over Olam. But Pasuk is careful to use the terminology of Keil Olam, not Ha'olam. Keil Olam means to say that Olam and Keil are essentially one idea, that the world itself is part of the godly reality, part of God Himself. It's not another entity, but it's the Keil itself is, the Olam itself is Keil. The world itself is where God decided to manifest Himself via Olam, but which ultimately says that there is only one entity, just like prior to creation, like we say, Atom Shalei, not Shalnei, Atom Shalnei is not that before HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, it was one. There's only Him, and after He created the world, there's two entities. He's in charge, but there's two entities. We say no. We clearly negate this notion. Atahu, it's the same Ata prior to creation and after creation. Ultimately, there's one God, though after creation, HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided He would express Himself, He would manifest Himself as Himself in a way of Olam. So, anybody could look at the previous class. We're going to go straight to where we left off. You can always see the previous classes in the link box Tanya, or on the TanyaOnline.com website, which is again it's solely for this class, and namely that one could easily follow the text, follow the class with the text, and additional to that, you can backtrack to any class, very easy accessibility to any other of the previous classes. So the Alter Rebbe mentioned over here the idea of then, and again this is where we'll pick up, of the Bitul Ha'olam is L'gabi L'kusi Yisbarach, the complete nullification or insignificance of Olam in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we mentioned, when we say insignificant, it's not about indifference, not about carelessness. Insignificant in the true context, in its true context, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, because it's not tofes makom, it doesn't make an impact, based on this notion that it's not another entity. When there is another entity, inevitably, as much as you're in control, you don't have full control. We gave a few examples in the last week's class. Now, if it's totally another entity, as much as you can be in control of this other entity, like an employer with an employee, or without any restrictions, yet in the same token, it's not the employee is not an extension of you. So hence, as a separate party, makes an impact on you. And if it makes an impact on you, you're not. Your control over it to some degree is limited. Your dominance over it, your say over it to some degree is limited, as much as on the surface. We gave an example: employer that doesn't have to form or relate his firing and hiring via a board, or he doesn't have to relate it to a board, he doesn't have to consult with the board. He hires and fires in seconds. Or even less, fired, meaning to say that the other party, he has full dominance over the other party. As an example, never has to be this way, but as an example, but the fact that the employee is not an extension of the employer, it's a separate entity. So in the most subtle ways, it can make an impact on him, and it does make an impact. And if it makes an impact, it means to say that as a separate entity, there is limited your control over them, even though on the surface you have full dominance. But you can say that it's as if you're moving your fingers. No, your fingers are part of you. It's an extension of you. It is you. In this case, it's a separate entity. So as much as you have control and dominance, again, we're just throwing some tidbits, expanding on this idea and the few examples which we gave in very last week's class. And this is what we say, Kel Olam, that the Olam is insignificant, means to say that it is not at all a separate entity. And if it's not a separate entity at all, this in itself shows that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not only in control of something else, this is Him, hence there is He's in full state of the dominance of every part of creation, because creation is not a separate entity of Him. It is all Him. So it is all Him. So when we say it's insignificant, it's not that He's indifferent, it's irrelevant to Him, everything that goes on in creation. Quite on the contrary, it's a clear and outright demonstration of how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu is dominant over everything. Because it's not a separate entity, it's insignificant in that context, that in the sense that in that it's all about Hashem. It's all about Hashem. So kula kamei kula chashiv. Everything is insignificant. Insignificant means say it's not a separate entity. It's not a separate entity. So it's Him. So faked, just the opposite. It shows it's the greatest demonstration. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is directly connected. Not only big stuff, small stuff, every intricate detail which transpires in creation, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is right there. That is Him, which is also gives us a clarity of. Or infuses, re-energizes our emunah, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu know that detail, or know this detail, or maybe it's just into the big stuff, or until He gets to the small stuff. That doesn't exist. That can only exist if somebody's dealing with something else, another entity. Did He get to that last detail? Or He didn't get to it. He will get to it. He can get to it at all times. He's in full control, full dominance, but maybe He didn't get there. As opposed to say kula kamei kula chashiv, it's not a separate entity. Insignificant in this case, it's not a separate entity. So there's no detail which is not part of Him. Just like the big stuff, small stuff, it's all like it's all Him. So it's all Him. He's in full control and full dominance, not only aware. This is the way He decided to express Himself by that detail which exists and becomes manifest within creation, within Olam, within the world, because the Olam itself is part of Kel. An example is meaning the person has his arm, which is more of a solid limb, and then he has fingers. These are details. He doesn't know exactly. Try to prick the arm, it'll hurt. The finger, he'll get there. No, the finger, the arm, it's all part of the person himself. He's the man. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created man. That there's the more solid limbs, and then it comes into details. As an example, fingers. That's part of the structure of man, and that's all part of it's part of the structure of man in this case. Exists also other parts of creation, but we're dealing with this example of man. And it doesn't mean because it comes into details, it's you have less feeling of it, or till you'll get to this which goes on with your fingers. It doesn't work with fingers as much as it's details. within the human being, yet it's all part of the human being. And similarly, creation, it's many details. So it's on the surface it seems to be removed from the achdus, the pshitus, which means that before HaKadosh Baruch Hu becomes manifest within his chalkos, divisiveness, and olam, worlds, and whatever, and the complexity of worlds, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides to express himself within olam, is similar kind of to the details of fingers in this example which we gave, but there's no such a thing. Hashem has to get to these details. Does he know about them? It is him. And that's the word Kilo Hashiv. So olam is on their own, and Kilo Hashiv is insignificant, Lagabei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Again, in this context, insignificant, meaning that it's something which is completely batal, stands with complete full self-nullification. And this is what the Alter Rebbe points out in Perik Chaf and Chaf Aleph, which he brings over here, and then eventually he'll add another mushal to make it even more even clearer, which he did not bring in the chapters 20 and 21. But he starts with it. We left off is with this example which the Alter Rebbe gives in these above mentioned chapters. We gave another example. Just to get into it, this with Alter Rebbe is relating over here. Take a leaf in comparison, say, place it in the face of all the leaves of the tree. How much significance does it have? Very little. Very little. Maybe thousands and thousands of leaves on one tree. So this leaf, in comparison to all the leaves of the tree, is very little, very minutia, very, you could use the word, kind of insignificant. If you look at the picture, if someone points out significance to leaves as an example. One leaf. Place the leaf, they go on and place the leaf in front of the leaves in the entire field, in the entire face of 100 trees, face of 1,000 trees, face of 1,000,000 trees, in the face of all the trees in the world. There's countless leaves, and take one leaf in comparison to that, to all the leaves in the world, it's truly insignificant. Take a teaspoon out of the Mediterranean. Someone's going to say, empty the Mediterranean, minimize the Mediterranean with one, made it less with 1 teaspoon. You take a teaspoon, you take out a teaspoon of water, that is, from the Mediterranean with one. It's almost kind of incorrect term. Ultimately, you did so. You did minimize the Mediterranean with 1 teaspoon when you did so, but it's almost kind of incorrect to even say it like that or think of it in that way, because what is 1 teaspoon in comparison to the infinite? It's not truly infinite. It's not truly infinite, because there's no true infinity when it comes to anything associated with creation. But in the context of matters, in the context of things, it's kind of the infinite amount of waters. So what is 1 teaspoon in comparison to all the infinite amount of teaspoons which exist in the Mediterranean? I made a dent. You didn't make no dent, because 1 teaspoon in comparison to all, you didn't truly, you perhaps made a dent again, because everything physical is ultimately infinite, finite. But it's incorrect. It's incorrect to say you made a dent, because what is 1 teaspoon in the face of all, 1 teaspoon in the face of all waters which exist in the Mediterranean? Almost nothing, perhaps nothing. Even though, like we said, in this physical world, you can't say truly nothing, but it's nothing. Yeah, the reaction is when you empty. You didn't empty nothing. So this, I'm giving this example, even though the latter example is brought not in Tanya, but it's brought in Likutei Torah and the other works of the Alter Rebbe quite a few times. Yet quite a few times, but just to enter into what the Alter Rebbe is saying there in these chapters, again 20 and 21, in this very Sefer HaTanya, which again I suggested in the past, last week, that in order to have clarity in this message, it's worthwhile to go back to the previous classes, or to those very chapters, easy to access and find and study, and based on the which we mentioned of the advantage of that website. It's worthwhile to go to the tanyaonline.com and find the chapter 2021 to have a adequate understanding of what the message the Alter Rebbe is saying, is conveying over here in this chapter. So basically, what the Alter Rebbe is saying, that we know the whole world was created basar mamaris, sayings of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Oisius, letters, Chav Beis Oisius, with the 24 letters. Hashem brought creation into being. Basar mamaris nibra ha'olam. The Eibishter created the world with 10 sayings. or deeper than that, a little more general. It says Ki b'ka Hashem tzuri lami. Hashem created tzuri lami, created the worlds b'ka, with the yud and the K. And the Gemara says that the Yud Nibra Ha'olam Haba, one Yud, the whole Olam Haba was created, but Hey, the Olam Hazeh, the whole Olam Hazeh was created with one Hey, with one letter. How you reconcile 2 letters as opposed to the 24 letters, all the 10 sayings? It's not really a contradiction. There's the way it's Bechlalos generally, it's with these 2 letters, and eventually, HaKadosh Baruch Hu used all the Asias, all the letters, ultimately. These 2 letters, again, this is Bechlalos, Bepratis, in detail. HaKadosh Baruch Hu used all the 24 Asias letters in order to create the world. Hashem spoke, and He spoke creation into being. We say Bereshis. Bereshis is 9 times Vayomer, and then Bereshis, as the Gemara says, Nami Maimer, who it's also a Maimer. So with 10 sayings, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world. Now you think about it, with even in the human, the way it is by man. What is one word? What is one letter, rather, in comparison to all the letters one speaks in one day? It's insignificant. A person could speak thousands and maybe beyond that, tens of thousands of letters and word letters, pronouncing letters in one day, especially if he speaks a lot, as he's a teacher, and so on and so forth. letters, not words, letters. There's one letter in comparison to all the letters he pronounces in one week, in 1 month, in comparison to all the letters he would pronounce in his entire lifetime. One letter in comparison to that. It's a bit like a teaspoon in the Mediterranean. How many letters a person pronounces, and what if he would live long? What if he lived forever? Theoretically, what is one letter that to the insignificant? One letter becomes more and more insignificant in the face of all the letters that he pronounced or he can pronounce. And then the Alter Rebbe goes there deeper. Take one letter, the way it's Isis HaDibur, one letter of speech, in comparison to a deeper part within the nefesh of the person himself. Letters are the most inferior, words are the most inferior dimension of expression on the surface of man, on the surface that is, right? We have dibur, then deeper than that is machshava, is thought. Deeper than machshava and thought goes the midas, the characters, the attributes, which sends signals to the thought. It's it's really part and parcel of the nefesh. And deeper even the character or the attributes are the intellectual faculties, which is Chochmah Bina Das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, which this ultimately, this person, what he intellectualizes, he understands something being leading, and he sees the toiv, let's say, he sees something good within it, within this idea, so that triggers the heart to desire it. If he thinks he understands it in a way that he comprehends, he perceives this being something, let's say, damaging, so the heart sends a signal to the heart to stay away from it, to be worried of it, and so on and so forth. So, as we know, wisdom produces feelings. Feelings send a signal to thought. Thought ultimately triggers speech. So, leads to speech. Speech stems from this which one thinks. So the more you go higher than from Dibur, in other words, from backwards, from Dibur into Machshava, you're going into deeper areas within the Nefesh itself. From Dibur to Machshava to thought, and going deeper than thought, because thought there's still Asius. Explain that in a moment. There's still letters, and there's a makeup of the letters within thought, within the thought process as well. We think in certain languages. As an example, obviously different than we express ourselves in the speech, but there are Isius and Machshava. Thought also has Isius letters. But then we go deeper into the Nefesh, where even Isius don't even exist. In feelings, the whole notion of otiyot, which is letters, don't even exist. Because it's part of the Nefesh experience, aren't my feelings, my attributes. Then you can go, then there's a dimension which is even deeper, which is Chochmah Bina Das, wisdom, understanding, in my intellectual faculties, where certainly there is no Asius. I mean, I use, the difference of intellectualizing and thinking. Thinking is the notion of thinking. Thinking is not necessarily associated, or isn't associated with intellect. The way I intellectualize, I use my thought. My thought becomes a garment in which I dress, in which I enclose my intellect, in order to develop a thought process. But thinking itself, a person who's not intellectual, who doesn't have an intellectual, he's not invested in any intellectual pursuits, or he's not invested in anything intellectual, his thought is always Mishetetes Tamid. It's constantly flowing. The most illiterate or a dumb person always constantly thinks. Thinking something that flows. If the machshava is constantly flowing, there's isis. There's letters and words and letters and words and so on. Language, again, different than the way it's in speech, but there it's extremely external in comparison to intellect on its own. In other words, how do we ultimately be intellectual? As we take the chachma, we dress it into machshava, and we're able to come out with a structured thought process. But Chabad itself, which is the chachma bina das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, which is basically the three faculties which exist with man's human's intellect, and is much deeper than the whole Isi Otiyot. Letters don't even exist there. It's part of the nefesh. So if one letter, in comparison to all the letters I have spoken in my life, one has spoken in his entire life, is so insignificant. Take that same letter, place it in the front, in the face of machshava, where letters are so much more subtle, and we think so many more letters and words and thought. Again, on the level of thought, the level of machshava, it doesn't come so bold as the way it is in speech, but yet otiyot there is, but there's so many more. It's like this drop of water of this lake, but take the drop of water in comparison to an ocean, to a sea. It becomes less significant. So, but this is a difference. It's a quantitative difference. But here's even a qualitative difference for the otiyot, the letters, the way they are in speech, in comparison to the letters, the way in machshava, is very totally different. So take that one letter, the way it is in speech. Basar ma'amaris nivra Hashem created the world with speech, and take that letter and face it and place it in front of Hashem's otiyot machshava. Much more insignificant than God's power of speech, and God does live forever. So even before you enter this notion of placing that one letter of the Maimer of the Ko, of the Yud Kei Tzurei Lamim, let's say the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu created this world is with one Hey, again, at least Bichlalut, with one Hey. Eventually again came through the 24 Otiyot, but even you're dealing with 24 Otiyot, the 24 letters. But let's look at that Maimer Azal, that saying of our sages, a blessed memory. Ki b'ko Hashem tzurei lamim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world with Yud Kei. So look Olam Hazeh, this physical world, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this world HaKadosh Baruch Hu created with Hey. One letter in the face of all Hashem's letters is already insignificant, totally insignificant, because Hashem doesn't live forever, and his Maimoret can be an expression of an infinite expression, or expression of an infinite measures. Then we go deeper within Hashem, and again in the example, when you're dealing with man, take one letter in the face of all the letters he ever spoke, or he can speak in the future, insignificant. Take that same letter in the face of otiyot machshava, the letters of thought, much more insignificant, carries becomes much smaller, much less significant, much more insignificant. And take that letter and place it in the face of a deeper part of me, a deeper part of the human being, which the letters don't even exist. So it's not even a quantitative difference. At this point, it's totally insignificant. And then you go deeper within the nefesh when you're dealing with not only feelings, attributes, but you're dealing with the intellectual faculties, which is a deeper part of the nefesh. That one letter of my one letter expression carries total insignificance. And take HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which everything by Him is by Hashem, is not only deeper a nefesh, there's Hashem, everything about Him is infinite. So even that one letter in the face of all letters, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu ever could have or did express on any level of Hashem, on any level that He decides to express or decided to express, one letter with which He created the world, that is the soul energy of Eilam, the soul energy of the world. And that letter in the face of all the Maimaris of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of Hashem, all the saying, all the letters which can or perhaps was expressed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, insignificant. Take that one letter, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world in the face of Hashem's machshava. Here you're dealing with quantity and quality, and it totally, again, you're talking about Hashem's machshava. Kilo machshavatai machshavatechem, Hashem's machshava. Even in the example, we can understand the insignificance of one letter. You can imagine the way it is by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then go deeper and deeper within God, and then Is there any significance to Olam? Is there any? Could anybody say there's God, and additional to God, there's another entity of Olam, of the world? The whole world was created by a mere letter of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even by a few letters of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In the face of the godly reality, it is totally insignificant. It's so much more than someone saying, "Oh, let's give significance to this drop, to this drop of the ocean. I took out a teaspoon of the entire Mediterranean. I emptied it. This is something. It's in comparison to the whole Mediterranean. This teaspoon is almost truly nothing." And when we're dealing with this world was created by an one letter of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ubasarim Amoros, HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying in the face of God, it is infinitely more insignificant or less significant than the example of 1 teaspoon in the face of the Mediterranean. So someone's going to say that there's 2 sets of water, that the Mediterranean and that teaspoon. And again, because we're dealing with the physical world, perhaps we can justifiably say that because everything physical ultimately is quantitatively measured. But when we're dealing with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when we're dealing with on infinite levels, we're dealing with God, which everything about Him is infinite. This one world which was created with an ot, 1 letter, or maybe a few letters, ultimately, again, B'pratiyut, in detail, Hashem used the 24 letters of the Aleph base in order to create the world. But what is this in comparison to the infinity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Himself? Nothing. Totally insignificant. So then someone's going to say, so this is the meaning. How can you say there's 2 entities? There aren't 2 entities. It's all about God. And just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu was there, with His great glory, and is an overwhelming presence prior to creation, it's exactly the same right now. It is inconceivable to give any significance, to even say that there is God and that there is as well an Olam. It's totally insignificant. Namely, again, this was another, as the Alter Rebbe clearly so carefully explains this in these above mentioned chapters. But we're going to read a few lines over here, which the Alter Rebbe recaps, and we left off on page Mem Beis at the words Kibitul, which is 5 lines from the top. Kibitul, Isis Hadibur, like the nullification and the insignificance of speech, the letters of speech, and thought, Bimkairon, in their Misharshan, the source and the root, which is Mahusa Nefesh Vatzmusa, in the comparison in the face of the essence of the soul, which is Eser P'chineseh, which are the 10 faculties, which is the 7 emotional faculties, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Chod, Yisod, Malchus, which is the 7 faculties which exist within the human being, emotional faculties, and then Chachma, Bina, Das, which are the intellectual faculties. This is the makeup of the Nefesh, where Isis don't even exist. So the letters don't even exist. Words don't even exist there. So 1 letter in comparison to the Nefesh, 1 letter which I uttered a year ago, 2 years ago, today, in comparison to my entire Nefesh, which letters and words don't even exist, is totally insignificant. Because again, the 10 faculties themselves, letters don't even exist. Before they invest in the garment of thought, again, as letters commence, initiate, where they established only the first place of their establishment, or where they established, is in the faculty of thought. Prior to thought, letters don't even exist. Letters and words are formed primarily, or the first place which the notion of letters and words exists is in thought. Deeper within the Nefesh thought, letters and words don't even exist. also take the entire, even Otiyot Machshava, which are much finer, more subtle level of Isis, more nafshi, gesol type of letters, but in the face of a place within the nefesh, or in the face of the nefesh itself, where Otiyot don't even exist, is completely insignificant. But the world wasn't even created with Isis and Machshava. The words of Machshava. The world was created with Isis and Dibur, which are way more inferior than thoughts, than letters of thought. This is letters of speech, which again more finite, more much more inferior than the Isis and Machshava. And these letters which Hashem created the world, or starting from the K, Yud K, the whole Ilmazah was created with these two letters. Take these two letters, what even a human being utters, in the face of his nefesh, which letters don't even exist, are totally insignificant. How much more so it is by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Like it's explained in the 20th and 21st chapter in length. Ayin Shom, even Alter Rebbe suggests, look there, because even we try to encapsulate and recap, even with the details over here in this chapter, and to explain these wording, but in order to have greater clarity in this above mentioned idea, it is worth, Alter Rebbe suggests, Ayin Shom, look there, and I suggest again, the easy way to access it is here, even on this site, or on the TanyaOnline.com, which you could reach, again, easily reach those chapters. And here the Alter Rebbe, as we mentioned at the beginning, adds another example, which will Be'ez Hashem pick up this coming week, another example which also demonstrates the insignificance of Olam in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the insignificance of world. In other words, Hashem's creation in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And again, let's be careful with that term insignificant. Insignificant meaning to say that it's not as totally inseparable. It's part and parcel of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not not being a separate entity on its own. I will add, as we said in the beginning, this following example, this is the first time in Tanya where the Alter Rebbe introduces it, even though I believe later the Alter Rebbe introduces in Tanya, but namely on other of the Alter Rebbe's works, he mentions the following example, but this is the first time the Alter Rebbe mentions it over here. So that's why he says Chaf and Chaf Aleph, he mentions the first example, as opposed to, let me just remember, I believe so. I believe it's the first time the Alter Rebbe mentions this. He has it later in Shar Yichud Hamuna, which is the second part of Tanya itself, or the Sefer Tanya. But I believe this is the first time the Alter Rebbe introduces this following example, which we will, which demonstrates from another perspective, with another example, but yet the same idea, the same above-mentioned idea, which we'll look forward continuing and picking up on it. Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach this coming week. Have a great night.